Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to give a little bit more explanation about the idea of a standard deviation. Not the calculations, but just the idea or the concept of the standard deviation. I just want you to get a sense of what it actually means, what it actually tells you. And I think it helps to take a complex concept like the standard deviation and put it into simple language or try to put it in as much plain language as possible. And whenever whenever you do that, there's a risk of oversimplifying things, but at the same time, I think that it's still good because it helps you really get the core idea of the concept. So the first of all, I need to mention that the word standard in everyday life means typical or average, and the word deviation means to deviate or go off track. So if if a train goes off its track, it's deviating. Um, in, in a class like sociology, you might hear the term social deviate or social deviation. That's a person who's going off from society's norms, from what's considered typical in society. That's social deviation. And in statistics, deviation really means the same thing. It means to go off track from the mean of a data set. And so, for example, a number that's 2 away from the mean is deviating by 2. A number that's 10 from the mean is deviating by 10. That's all deviation means. So if you take the word standard and deviation and put them together, what it means is the typical or average amount that a data value differs from the mean, or the typical or average amount that a data value is away from the mean. That's all the standard deviation is. So standard, typical or average, deviation from the mean. And I just wanted to give a few hypothetical examples, just some imaginary examples, just to help get the idea down. So in this first example, imagine a population of people living in a certain city. And in this population, the mean or average hours of sleep is 7. That's at the center right here. And the standard deviation is 2. So what this means is in this population, it's typical or average for a person to be 2 away from the mean on either side. So a person who's getting 9 hours of sleep and who's 2 above the mean is a standard or typical person, and a person who's 2 below the mean and getting 5 hours sleep is also a standard or typical person. So being being 2 above the mean is standard or typical in this population, and being 2 below the mean is also standard or typical in this population. So if you meet a member of this population and the person tells you that they're getting 9 hours of sleep, and the person says, "Am I unusual?" You would say, "No, you're not unusual. You're 2 above the mean, so you're pretty standard." Or if you meet someone in the population who's getting 5 hours of sleep, and the person says, "Am I unusual?" You would say, "No, you're not very unusual. You're not very extreme. You're 2 from the mean, so you're pretty standard or typical." Now, if the standard deviation is 2, there are going to be some population members who are more than 2 from the mean. Those people will either be out in this tail up here or way down in this left tail right here. And there are going to be some people who are closer to the mean than 2. Those people would be in this middle area right around the mean of 7. They're closer than 2 to the mean. But the standard or typical or average distance from the mean is 2 in this situation, because I've said that the standard deviation is 2. Now, you might have noticed that the MAD and the standard deviation sort of sound similar, they sound like they have the same meaning. And the standard deviation and the MAD are actually really similar. They're actually almost exactly the same concept. If you take a data set and you calculate the standard deviation and the MAD of that data set, your two answers will come out to about the same number. For example, if the MAD comes out to 4.5, the standard deviation might come out to, let's say, 4.7. they're going to come out to about the same number. That's because they're basically the same concept. They tell you the same thing about a data set. They just come out to slightly different numbers, and they have different formulas. And it turns out that the standard deviation is used more often than the MAD for reasons that we'll get to later on. The standard deviation has more usefulness than the MAD in a variety of situations. And let's just quickly go over example 2 and 3. So if the mean of a population is 35 and the standard deviation happens to be 50, then actually, sorry, I meant to put 5, not 50. So just imagine that that 0 isn't there. So if the standard deviation is 5, then the mean is 35, the average, but it's typical or average or not surprising for a person to be 5 from the mean. So if you come across someone who's 5 below the mean or 5 above the mean, that person is pretty typical for this population. I'm sorry, let's see. This should also be mean age is 50. If this is 5, this should be 30, and this should be 40, because those people are at these 2 points. So if the standard deviation is 5, then 30 and 40 are at the standard distance or standard deviation away from the mean. So sorry, those should also be changed, because notice how here it's 7. The standard deviation is 2, and this is 2 down and 2 up. And if this is 5, this should also be 35 down and 45 up. Sorry, I should have fixed all of these numbers. But it's okay, because we have 2 other examples that are correct. This was just a typo. So imagine a population of people living in a certain city. The mean salary is 60,000 per year, and the standard deviation is 20,000. Let's just imagine that. Well, in this population, it's typical or average for a person to be 20,000 below the mean or 20,000 above the mean. So if a person from this population tells you they're making 40,000 per year, you would say to that person, well, you're 20,000 below average, but that's pretty typical in this population. It's pretty standard. And if a person tells you they're making 80,000, you would tell that person, well, you're 20,000 above the mean, so you're pretty typical or standard. You're not too unusual. That's what standard deviation is. That's what it's actually telling you about the data set in everyday language. So hopefully this helps you. Just let me know if you have any questions.